Good evening, and welcome to American History of Black Theater with Evan Woodson and Kayla Zielinski. Hosted by Carroll County Public Library and sponsored by Macbeth Academy and Carroll Citizens for Racial Equality. I'm Dorothy Stoltz with the Carroll County Public Library. My colleague Lisa Picker will be helping with behind the scenes tech this evening. Thank you, Lisa. Before we introduce our very special guests, I'd like to go over a few online housekeeping items. Uh, Whether you're joining us through Facebook or through YouTube, use the chat box, ask your questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can. And the recording, I want to remind everybody, will be posted to the library's YouTube page after the program, so you can find it there. Tonight's program will give an overview of the history of Black theater in America starting in the 19th century and how the theater experience has engaged the wider community and continues to do so today. And now I'd like to introduce Kayla Zielinski, who will in turn introduce Evan. Kayla is head of school for Macbeth Academy, which is an international learning school offering private virtual classes. And Kayla is one of our important family engagement partners here with the library. So let's please welcome Kayla Zielinski.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, and thank you so much for this program. I know, I'm really excited. So we have a very exciting program today, and before I get into what we're going to be learning, I want to introduce Mr. Evan Woodson. He is our African Diaspora Studies instructor at Macbeth Academy, and he is an expert on African American history. And he's actually tuning in from Brazil, so it's very important. This is an international event now. And what we're going to be learning about today is we've organized the whole event into 4 acts. And it's African American representation in theater from the 1800s all the way to today. So without further ado, Evan, I'm going to let you start this wonderful presentation.
Kayla, I appreciate it. Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you, Lisa, for opening behind the scenes. Thank you for giving me a platform to talk about Black history. I am coming to you live and direct from Brazil. I'm in Salvador, Brazil. I teach African Diaspora Studies at Macbeth Academy. I have a lot of experience teaching Black history in different places and different forms. Our conversation this evening is going to focus not really on the wider African diaspora, but specifically on the United States and the Black experience in the United States through the lens of film, through the lens or the prism of performance and stage. And I want to open by talking about yes, we do have 4 acts. At times, we will get into a lot of film as well as just theater. I don't think it's possible to really separate those two. So for the theater purists out there, I apologize. As we get into the modern era, we're going to veer a little bit into the film world. But I want to very, very briefly, before we get started, just kind of talk about the 4 acts and kind of lay out our timeline. You can see the timeline there at the bottom. At the beginning of each act for us, I will post our timeline here at the bottom so you can see we do begin in the 1800s. Our first act is going to be all about this phenomenon, this cultural tradition that's called blackface, and how that is really a misrepresentation and kind of a bastardization almost of West African cultures and African American cultures that pre-existed that. After that, we'll get into the jazz era. We'll talk about the Harlem Renaissance, and we'll start looking at examples of films where there's actually audio and music. Act 3 will take us through World War II, the 40s, 50s, and 60s into the Civil Rights era. And then our final act, which I'm really excited about, I'm going to kind of put together the Black Power movement and what I believe that is happening now within Black film and theater and performance. There's not really a word for it. I don't know that anybody has really coined a term, but there are some people now that are calling this almost like a new Black Renaissance. So that'll be a really, really positive high point for us to leave off of. And unfortunately, we're going to start in kind of a dark place here in the 1800s with a conversation about African American culture and blackface. So Dorothy, without further ado, if you could go ahead and get us started, and let's take a look, an overview here at Act 1. So I want to preface Act 1 by saying that some of the images here that we're going to see are very, very uncomfortable. These are classically ugly, racist stereotypes of who we are as Black people, as African American people in the United States. And this is a global visual set of symbols that we're going to engage with and talk about. So I want to acknowledge that this is not easy to look at this. We're starting in a very dark place here. But before we do that, Dorothy, let's go forward to Act 1, Scene 1, and let's just talk about what theater is for a minute and what it isn't and where it's from. So when we think about the idea of theater, okay, when I say the word theater, whether I spell it the American way with the ER or the British way with the RE, we are imagining something that is really European in origin. Specifically, it comes from Western Europe, it comes from Shakespeare. You picture here on the screen of the Globe Theatre in London, England. And we need to understand that as Black people in this country, this is not a medium that we invented. So when our culture and when our opportunities come on stage, we are in an environment that we did not create. Now, that doesn't mean that West African people didn't have forms of drama, right? Our West African ancestors had music, and we have an oral tradition. We have ways of making meaning of who we are, and we absolutely have music and traditions, but it wasn't exactly in this perfectly Shakespearean format. Okay, so I want to begin by saying that our theme today, one of our themes for this evening is representation. And it's very, very difficult as an African descended person in this country, or here where I am in Brazil or in Cuba, to represent yourself using someone else's language or standing up on someone else's stage. And so I think it's a good place to start by challenging us to think about theater, as we often think of it, is a European concept. This is a white or Western idea, and we are forced to fit into this concept. So that's, I think, a good way to begin our conversation before we get into any detail just about what theater is.
All right. So my role here is as moderator is to ask questions and ask the audience's questions and also questions that come up for me. And one question that I have is, when you say representation, I think that's really important. Can you elaborate on representation? And then what is the purpose of theater? Because now we're talking about what can the purpose be for the audience or the people that are creating the art.
So for representation is, what is the difference between who I am in reality versus what I am doing on stage, right? So a bad representation would be X here, Y up here, right? So we don't always have to be perfect in the representations. I mean, it's drama. It's literally supposed to be dramatic, right? It's supposed to be theatrical. But later on today, we're going to talk about some examples of negative representation or incomplete representation in the form of stereotypes. And I think we can build out, when we begin here with talking about blackface, I think it'll be pretty obvious pretty quickly the degree of representation that we're talking about. The purpose of theater, I think, is making meaning. Right now, you're looking at a painting on screen. There is a lot that we could say about the meaning of African descended people in this country rebelling and fighting back against this horrible system of slavery that, unfortunately, it's not our beginning historically, because our beginning historically is in West Africa pre-slave trade, but it is our beginning. It's the situation, it's the act that we stepped into when we arrived here in 1619 in the United States for the first time. So when we talk about the purpose of theater is about making, it's about how we remember ourselves. It's about, at the end of the day, it's about how we represent ourselves and who we are. So I think another really, really good beginning point is recognizing aspects of African American culture that actually existed before blackface, right? And there's a short list of these on stage, or on stage, on screen. The screen is our stage here this evening. But there's a number of things that we have created and brought with us from West Africa and blended with the experiences we've had here: spirituals, work songs, the early versions of what we would eventually call blues music. I have some family right now that are tuning in from St. Louis, Missouri, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, and maybe even Alaska. And our roots go back to Mississippi. And this tradition of work songs and blues music is absolutely part of that Black heritage that I have personally. And then we have language, right? We have a lot of scholars don't consider it a completely different language, but many scholars over the past 20 or 30 years have started to define African American speech as a dialect of English, and that would be called AAVE, or African American Vernacular. It's a mix, it's an interpretation of the English language through our West African heritage and traditions. So all of these things exist before blackface. And all these things exist before the ugly minstrelsy that we're going to see here in a minute. And I think it's a good beginning point to understand that there is the original and then there's the copy. There's the original and then there's the imitation.
Wow.
So begin here with a quick video from a little clip here from a PBS resource. This is a great resource for educators, for people out there that are interested to learn more. This is called Crash Course. In this particular episode, I believe it's called Blackface and Minstrelsy or something like that. And I think it's really, really important for us to be able to see what this actually looked like, to be able to like confront it and engage it. And again, I think we're familiar with this already, but I do think it's important to have a little bit of historical context here for the form, the shape that blackface actually took.
Mm-hmm.
African Americans were largely subjects of caricature, comedy, and racism in American theater. The minstrel show was a widely popular and deeply racist 19th century genre created by white Americans. It allowed other white Americans to laugh at stereotyped portrayals of African Americans. Initially, it was performed by white actors in blackface, a kind of theatrical makeup that used burnt cork, grease paint, and even shoe polish to darken the skin, and other makeup to exaggerate the eyes and lips. Later on, when African Americans began to perform in minstrel shows, they had to use blackface too, transforming themselves into the caricatures that white audiences demanded. The genre is usually credited to T.D. Rice, or Daddy Rice, a New York actor who sang and danced in blackface in variety entertainments. He styled himself as an Ethiopian delineator, created a character named Jim Crow, and popularized the song Jump Jim Crow. In the late 19th century, racist laws enforcing segregation in the southern United States became known as Jim Crow laws after Daddy Rice's character.
Wow.
There's so much. Number of things. Yeah, there's a number of things we can take away from it. And we are going to pause here for a minute and just kind of chew on and digest this. What I want us to think about, I think right now we are familiar with what blackface looks like. Right. Mm-hmm. If you were to go walk up to somebody on the street and say, hey, out of these 4 pictures, right, choose the one that's blackface. Most people could identify it. But I think the darker and the deeper and the scarier thing that we need to talk about is the function of blackface. Right. Like if this is a cultural tradition and theater has a purpose, the question that we need to think about now, and what I would challenge viewers at home and other people to think about, is why would people participate in this art form? Right, like what do we have to gain from it? And I think that's a place that the conversation about blackface often doesn't get to.
Right. Well, let's think about it in terms of like history, right? So whenever I think of representation in art, I think it's sometimes it's a reflection, or it's a response to something that's happening historically. So thinking about this in context, what's going on? How are African Americans treated? And what was interesting is watching the video is that there were African Americans that did blackface too. So what is the function, like you said, of this character? Like, what do you think?
And we're picking up our story really in the middle of what we call African American history, because we're beginning in the 1800s. Like I mentioned before, we've been here since 1619 in this country, right? By the time we get to the late 1800s, which is when blackface and minstrelsy develops as an art form, as a theatrical form in media, we are in a weird place as African Americans in this country. We are no longer technically, theoretically enslaved, right? 1860s, we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. In theory, slavery is over because of the Union victory in the Civil War, right? But we are not yet full citizens in reality. So we are existing in this limbo. And we're going to talk more about that limbo during the time period of World War I and World War II. We continue to exist in that limbo in a lot of ways, even still today. But minstrelsy, I think, functions as a way for white, not obviously it's a tool of racism. Okay, it's white supremacy. It's a way to put people down. It's a way to restore or try to bring back that older structure where you have black folks down here and white folks up here. But I want to introduce a new curve to this conversation. Many of the white performers, many of the performers that we considered to be white, at the time they were doing this work, were not actually considered to be white. Some of these people were immigrants or the children or grandchildren of immigrants from places like Ireland and England and Poland. And so for the function of blackface, oftentimes it allows white immigrants to quote unquote become American and to somehow like separate themselves and say, look at who I am because of what I'm not, right? Look at this person over there. Look at this African descended person, right? How crazy, how funny is it that I'm dressing up and pretending to be something that I'm not? And there's a lot of really good scholarly work that's been done on different immigrant groups and how they've been able to use blackface to become white and to become American. And I think psychologically, later on at the end of our session today, we're going to talk a little bit about the movie Get Out from Jordan Peele. And there's a concept in that movie where he talks about being in the sunken place. And it really reminds me of like that sad clown kind of blackface character. The video mentioned that African Americans, oftentimes actual black people, to participate, to get a job in the theater, they oftentimes had to go along with this blackface. So you had to become that caricature oftentimes as a black performer just to get on stage, just to make any kind of living.
Well, I know that we're a little bit over on this section, but my major question is, does blackface still happen?
Absolutely, it does. Not to the same degree. You're not going to see massive theatrical productions of millions of dollars being put into it now. We often think of blackface now as something that is like it's a controversial news thing that gets the news cycle going for a couple of days. A politician here, somebody uncovers frat photos from the 1970s where some governor, has this blackface on. But there are recent examples. Tropic Thunder came out not too long ago, and there's a conversation now about Robert Downey Jr. and his quote unquote blacking up, right? So it's something that we're still dealing with. But I think in terms of representation, to move us forward into our second act, as we get out of the late 1800s and early 1900s, we start to see more authentic forms of representation of African American culture on stage and on film.
Excellent. Thanks.
So we are now entering what we would call the jazz era. Okay, this is Act 2 now. We're going to run from about 1900 to 1940. Technically speaking, for the film buffs out there, this is where we're going to start getting to your bread and butter, your meat and potatoes, right? We're going to start talking about motion pictures. But again, to preface this period, Kayla, you made a great point a minute ago talking about how this is reactionary. Performance is about reacting to the world and kind of trying to present a contrary image maybe to how I'm represented. We're going to start this era of film, unfortunately, in 1927 with a movie that was called The Jazz Singer. This is a crucial movie because it was one of the first times that spoken words were ever recorded and synchronized on film. And here's the finale of that film, The Jazz Singer. And we're going to again have this encounter with this blackface character.
Mammy, the sunshine beats, the sunshine wet. I know where the sunshine best. Mammy, Mammy, my heartstrings are tangled around. Well, Mammy, I'm a coming. Sorry, I made you wait. I'm coming. I hope and trust I'm not late. Mammy, Mammy, I'd walk a million miles for one of your smiles. My Mammy, oh, Mammy, my little Mammy. The sunshine beats, the sunshine wet. I know where the sunshine sets. It's on my Mammy I'm talking about. Nobody else's. My little Mammy. My heartstrings are tangled around. Well, Mammy. Mammy, I'm coming. I hope I didn't make you wait. Mammy, I'm coming. Oh, God, I hope I'm not late. Mammy, don't you know me? It's a little baby. I'd walk a million miles for for one of your smiles. Oh, my,
That's hard to watch.
Is.
There's-
And this, it's hard to watch now in 2021, 90 years later. But this is what we're up against, right? This is the degree to which that blackface culture has been baked into everything that we know as American performance, right? But here's the beautiful thing about the 1920s, 30s, and 40s is that we are able to punch back in a way that we could not in the 1800s. We see a lot of really, really beautiful, deep, like racial conversations happening in the 20s and 30s as a result of the Harlem Renaissance. And one of the works that I can point us to is a play by Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes is probably the most famous writer person within the Harlem Renaissance movement that we know of. And he wrote a play in 1935 called Mulatto. And as you can see a little bit from the playbill, it's about a character who is both black and white. It's this tragic mulatto tale, but with a different spin on it. And again, this is a great way for us to think about theater and the purpose of theater. It's all about commentary. It's about representation. And you better believe that Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston and all these writers and activists of this time period had a lot to say about being black in America during this time period of World War I, in between World War I and World War II.
Mm-hmm. So I always ask, like, what, if this is a reactionary, why now? What's changing between 1927, where there's blackface, the jazz singer, and then these people have, this platform now to talk about blackness, and then the Harlem Renaissance, like art and music and poetry and everything. It's just an explosion of black art. So where's that coming from? What is that a reaction to, and why is it the perfect storm in the 1920s and 30s?
The perfect storm. And I would say there's two things happening that are interconnected. Number one is what we call the Great Migration. And number two is what we all know now as the Great War or World War I. So many African Americans are being pulled and pushed to northern cities from the southern states that many of us come from. Again, I mentioned before, on my dad's side of the family, got some folks tuning in here from St. Louis, Missouri. My dad was born in St. Louis, Missouri, but my grandmother was born in Greenwood, Mississippi. And that's quite a journey. Those are not two places that are close together. And many African Americans are leaving the South because of this ugliness, because of the lack of opportunity. And one of the things that is pulling us up to Chicago, to Detroit, to St. Louis, to New York, to Philadelphia is job opportunities, which are being generated by World War I, and which are being generated by industrialization. So by the time we get to the end of World War I, there are hundreds of thousands of African Americans who have served their country on the global stage for the first time ever, and they come back home from World War I, and it's a different ball game, right? My perspective has changed because I've seen the world. And I'm in my service uniform, right? And my girlfriend, my wife, my younger sister has worked in the factory to replace the job of a white man who was sent over. So this is what's happening in the 20s and 30s and even into the 1940s. There's a renewed sense of who we are as American citizens, for sure.
Wow, excellent. Okay, so did we already talk about mulatto? Like, what is, first, if someone's doesn't know, what is a mulatto, and why do you think Langston Hughes chose that character?
So this is very loaded. This is controversial, kind of in the same way that blackface is controversial. It's a word that historically is a reference to somebody essentially like me who has mixed European and West African ancestry. Now, depending on what culture, what part of the world you're talking about, depending on what time period, this is a term that's pejorative. It's a term that's derogatory. It's sort of like the way we think about the term Negro or colored. It's outdated. But Langston Hughes, I think, chose to write about this because at the time we're having these conversations about what it means to be black, what it means to be white in this new world, this new America. And I think by combining these two worlds and writing about millions of people that we have in our communities, like myself, this was a way for us for Langston Hughes to really make a bigger conversation about race, I think, in the 1920s and 30s.
And can you imagine, this is 1935. Like, can you imagine being so forward thinking in 1935 where you're questioning, yeah, we're black, but also there were lots of other things, right? That's interesting.
I mean, that negotiation of what it means to be how Black are you? What does it mean to be quote unquote not fully Black? But these, again, like you
Wow.
said, these conversations were happening 90 years ago. This is
Yeah.
not something that you can Google on the internet, right? He can't just, rip something off of YouTube. He's writing this and it's just, straight off the dome on pencil and paper. By the time we get to World War II, by the time we get to 1940s, as a nation, we've repeated this same cycle over again. And now, once again, we're at war. Okay, and we're in the middle of this World War, this Second World War, when I think we reached the peak of like African American global culture. And so we're going to spend some time here talking about the 40s and 50s. As we're about at our halfway point here, I think it's a great opportunity for us to sit back and just enjoy some really authentic, genuine African American culture on stage, on camera, as opposed to some kind of imitation. So what you're going to see here is a film clip from a movie that was called Stormy Weather. It was this scene in particular features two dancers named the Nicholas Brothers and one very, very famous composer, arguably one of the greatest composers ever, Cab Calloway. So here they are performing in Stormy Weather.
Shalimar, Swanee Shore. Let me dig this jive once more, boy. Right on down to the gate. Oh, boy. Gotta take my little gate. Now can't you hear those hep-hats call? Come on, boys, let's have a ball. The jim, jump it, jive makes you dig your jive on the mellow side. Hep, hep. Hip, hip. The jim, jump is a solid jive. Makes you 9 foot tall when you're 4'5". Hip, hip. Hip, hip. Now don't you be that inkaroo, get help, come on, and then you follow through. You get your study food, you make up the jaunty jumpers like the Gators do. Jim, jump is a jumping jive, makes you like your eggs on the Jersey side. Hip, hip. Hip, hip. The jim, jumping jive makes you hep, on the Mahala side. Diddly, bumpity, goodly, giddly, bang, 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 da-da. Now I've told you about the jumping jive. Jim, jump the jumping jive. You got to dig this mellow jive. Yes, you're digging on the mellow jive. A boodly, boy. Diddly, diddly, gaga. A boodly, jive, boy. Going to get like the bomb, see the night, the boy.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
So you want to talk about a performance that is timeless and that holds up
Yes.
in entertainment value decades later.
Oh,
Again,
yeah.
let's try to think about this. Look at how thrilling it is when we have an opportunity to be ourselves on stage.
Oh,
Look at what happens when the music is written by us, when the dance choreography is us, right? And when the cast is us, and when the writers and the directors are us. And this is a great preview, I think, for this new Black Renaissance that we're in right now. But it's a breath of fresh air after like 31 minutes of conversation about like ugly racial stereotypes and seeing people imitate us and insult us and push us down. This is what's so beautiful about the jazz era, is because we finally start to push back, and we're given a little bit of that room and that space on stage to say, this is who we are, and we are American and we are African at the same time, and y'all can deal with it. This is who we are, right?
Excellent.
So let's move now. Yeah,
we do have a question from Ron Mitchell. He says the first comment was represent Evan, and then the second comment was, so Hollywood produced these movies because they were profitable in all markets? Good question. I wonder, I think he's talking about maybe this movie, but I was thinking also, my question to add on to Ron Mitchell's is, were the Blackface movies also profitable? Like, how did this get produced in 1943?
Right. So there's a couple of things going on. So I would say that generally, yes, Blackface was profitable. One of the things that is unfortunate about this history of Blackface and minstrelsy, Blackface was considered one of the first purely American forms of theater, and it was exported around the world. There were some people in England and other places around the world that had this on their stage, and they were able to see this. So yes, Blackface was profitable because white supremacy is profitable and makes money for certain groups of people and people in certain institutions. Wow. What I will say is that Hollywood sometimes has a reputation for being super progressive and like on the cutting edge of freedom movements. And that's not really the case. Oftentimes Hollywood is a step behind. Hollywood doesn't do anything if it doesn't make money, right? And the thing we need to keep in mind that when this movie is coming out in 1943, right, we are nearing the end of World War II. And it's, as we're going to get into when we get into Act 4 or Act 3, it's becoming obvious that the capitalist side of World War II, the United States, England, France, we're going to be locked in a long battle against communism around the world. And so what we see is the United States, despite all the horrible things that it's done to us, every opportunity the U.S. has to throw us up there as a poster child and say, look how great America is. I mean, imagine growing up in communist Russia, or maybe even later on in communist Cuba or communist China, where freedom of expression is so limited by the government. And then the United States comes along and says, look how great our country is. Look at these, look how happy these Negroes are. Essentially, that would be the language they would use at the time. So there's a debate happening around the world. And to answer my cousin Mitch's question, it was profitable. It was profitable, I think, in many, many markets. In an increasingly global market that the United States was aware of, right? So let's go ahead and let's get into Act 3, because Act 3 is going to take us into this time period of World War II, and let's talk a little bit about what's happening and why we start to see so much more representation and different representations. So again, the same year that the movie Stormy Weather came out, we have a great film. I saw this movie in college, fell in love with it. It's called Karma Jones. We have Dorothy Danders on one side, and then we have Harry Belafonte. Harry Belafonte is still with us, by the way. He's still living. This movie came out in 1954, but it was written for Broadway during World War II. Dorothy, go ahead and take us to scene 1 so we can see another screenshot from this film.
Wow.
It's a great example of what we've been talking about, Kayla, in terms of genuine representation. Right now, if we were to look at the writing team, there are absolutely, I'm sure that there are white writers that are involved in this. But this is an all-black cast on film. in segregation era America, right? And this is why Harry Belafonte and Dorothy Dandridge and people from this generation mean so much to us, because they were able to start to pull us out of this era of segregation, right? So this is a wonderful representation, not only of African Americans during World War II, but of African Americans actually participating in World War II, right? Like, one of the messages of these films is that we are a part of this story too. We fought Hitler and the Japanese too, right? We were there in the trenches and we served in the factories, and we risked our lives just like white Americans. So there's a lot of really cool conversations happening between art and like the military world in America in the 1940s.
One question I have is, was Harry Belafonte and Dorothy Dandridge, were they like A-list celebrities, like how we would think of like a Brad Pitt or an Angelina now? And how does that, what do you think? Were they universally loved?
I would say yes, with a big asterisk, right? Because when we talk, it's very hard to compare eras, right? It's hard to compare Jordan with LeBron, right? It's hard to talk about Babe Ruth in the same conversation as like Mark McGuire, right? But I do think that somebody like Harry Belafonte he benefited from being an American in some of the same ways that Frank Sinatra benefited from being an American, right? Harry Belafonte's people came from the islands. He has Caribbean heritage. He has, I think, Trinidadian heritage, right? Big up all the island people, them. But he steps into the United States, much like Sidney Poitier, his people also from the Caribbean, who we'll talk about in a minute. But he steps into the United States and he becomes a part of this Black American glamour, right? Which really at its core is American glamour. And yes, to answer your question, I think a lot of these actors and actresses, they are A-list people. Everybody in Hollywood in the 1960s knew who Sidney Poitier was. Everybody in the 50s knew who Harry Belafonte was. Josephine Baker was one of the most clamored for, one of the highest paid dancers and performers in Paris, France, in the 1920s and 30s. So there's something magical about being able to escape that ugly form of representation. And in some cases, and in the super A-list actors, these are Hollywood elite people. And later on in a few minutes, we'll talk a little bit about hip hop in Hollywood and how these A-list actors kind of come back full circle. But absolutely, yeah, these are people who have global fame and who are embraced. But the other side of this, of course, Harry Belafonte uses that stage to comment about race. Sidney Poitier, in his acceptance speeches for being the first Black actor or actress to win a lead role for an Oscar, he uses these opportunities, and Dorothy Dandridge and Josephine Baker literally uses these opportunities for the betterment of us. But yes, they're A-list actors for sure.
Excellent. Well, you said Josephine Baker and you said Paris, and I had to mention that being an international star and being respected around the globe and then having to come home to segregation, it had to have been, I mean, Josephine Baker decided not to come back. So the idea is, how can you be an international, it has to be some kind of a very tough identity question of like, I'm an international star, but when around the world, but when I come back home, I'm still, a second-class citizen.
Dilemma that many generations of African Americans have grappled with. And again, I can talk about my own family. In a minute, we're going to talk about Miles Davis, who is from St. Louis, Missouri. My grandfather was a surgeon who stayed in Asia after the Korean War because opportunities existed for him there as a Black lead surgeon in the 50s and 60s that did not exist in the same way in the United States. So this is a conversation that we'll see happening. James Baldwin, after World War II, just says, essentially, F this country, I'm out. Like nothing can happen to me in Europe that's worse than what was happening to me in the United States.
At home, in the place where I was born.
Exactly. And I think this is where, again, jazz music and somebody like Miles Davis in the 1950s can teach us a lot, right? We are now at like the jazz world has evolved by the time we get to the late 50s. And Dorothy, let's have a look at Miles Davis. Let's go ahead and move on to the next scene.
We did actually have one comment. I had to bring it up. It was from Mr. Jeffrey Woodson, and he says, "Excellent question, Mitch. Isn't this awesome? Love listening to my son teach."
Man, this is like a Woodson family takeover. It's a Woodson Mitchell thing. I told you, I put the bat signal up there, and a couple hours ago, I was like, hey. No, it is great, and I think, and this is what's so cool about African American history is that we are all mean, you've heard about 6 degrees of separation, but with African American history, we've had such a unique experience in this country that it's really about 3 degrees of separation. Absolutely. There are very few Black folks that are from Chicago who don't have people in Mississippi. And these lines and these traditions of the Great Migration and movement are all connected because we have had such a unique experience as a small minority numbers-wise in this country, right? And despite the fact that we are very small in numbers, our influence is massive. Like when people say that they love American movies and American music, 80% of what they're talking about, they mean that they like Will Smith and hip hop, and they like African American culture. Really is what they're talking about. In this time period, after World War II, when these conversations globally are happening about capitalism and communism, jazz is at the center of these conversations. So jazz kind of cools out a little bit. In the late 50s, jazz becomes more of an intellectual music. It's not so much like a super hype, let's dance and jump and do the splits off of the top rope or off the stage. Right. Now there's something intellectual happening, right? And people like Miles Davis, who are African Americans, are traveling around the world in Asia, in Europe, like my grandfather was able to do. And we're now having, again, in the same way we were in the 20s, we're now going to start having really, really serious conversations again about who we are as African Americans and what it even means to be both African and American.
So now I'm seeing like a change from like the 1943 till now. Everyone's so happy, that Cab Calloway song, everything's really happy. Yeah. Like, we're finally getting to express ourselves. And now it's turning a little more political. Like, yes, who are we? Let's represent ourselves. But what does that mean, and as a political kind of, how are we going to express ourselves in art and also see that reflected in legislation and laws and how we're treated?
And there's even another conversation we can have is, what role does the United States government play in how we are representing ourselves? Because again, we live in a nation that, at least in theory, is supposed to be based on freedom, the idea of a free market. So if the world loves jazz music, if France and England and people in Japan are buying jazz records like crazy, the United States government is in a unique situation because our government wants to prove more than anything else that America is the best country on earth and that capitalism is superior to communism. So there are jazz artists, if I'm not mistaken, Dizzy Gillespie was a jazz artist who essentially took part in what we would now call as like a propaganda tour, where he was touring. Dave Brubeck did the same thing, where he was touring behind the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe. So it's a dilemma, right? It's I have my culture that's within the United States, and now my country is trying to use me in the time period of segregation as an example of how great this country is.
Like a poster.
And that's why it gets so politicized. You do have people outside the music world. You have people like W.E. Du Bois, who was an intellectual who came up in the early 1900s. But then you have artists in the 1940s, like Paul Robeson, who eventually turned left, like a hard swing to the left politically, and they end up on blacklists. And they can no longer find work in Hollywood. And they all of a sudden, Billie Holiday is in the same conversation. The way that she used the song "Strange Fruit" during this time, the U.S. government brought the hammer down on her. Just last night, I was watching a really, really cool conversation. There's a film coming out on Hulu called "The United States versus Billie Holiday." So I encourage you guys to check that out when it comes out at the end of the month. But this is a fascinating time, this World War II era in African American history, as we turn the page and we get into what we would consider the civil rights movement. Okay, this is kind of classically what we think of as the 1960s. We start to see within Hollywood, and Dorothy, let's have a look at Sidney Poitier and Ruby Dee, two of my favorite actors and actresses ever. So there we have Lorraine Hansberry's classic play Raisin in the Sun, which was written in 1959, the same year that Miles Davis dropped Kind of Blue, and jazz music is exploding around the world. We have this film. Sidney Poitier starts to win Oscars. He starts to win Academy Awards. And we start to see for the first time some mainstream acceptance within the United States film industry, the theater industry, of fully human Black characters. And I would be remiss here if I didn't acknowledge that there was another person who won an Academy Award long before Sidney Poitier, and that was Hattie McDaniels. But that was for a role in 1939 that was about 2 steps away from a blackface minstrelsy kind of performance. She played a quote unquote loyal enslaved person in the film Gone with the Wind. And that was not the kind of representation that was good for us or that was true for our experience at all. Once we get to the 60s, and especially in the 70s and 80s, we start seeing actors and actresses, and specifically writers like Lorraine Hansberry, who start to represent us in a way that is full and is human and is authentic, and it is very real. And we see that, again, because of the civil rights movement.
It looks like the Academy Awards, by giving or awarding Sidney Poitier with the award, are they recognizing or validating his form of acting and representing himself with, you know, with poise, and like, what do you think?
Yeah, and I think there's a little bit of that like Jackie Robinson mindset where, you know, Sidney Poitier was like almost too perfect. If you watch his old performances, because again, he has Bahamian ancestry, he has a little bit of this like British classically trained aura, right? Which is doesn't necessarily jive with what you would see among just like a regular black dude on the street in Philadelphia in the 60s and 70s. But I do think just having a black man occupy that place, and the Academy Awards, looking at this tall, handsome, square-jawed, kind of Buzz Lightyear looking black dude in the early 1960s, 1961, right? This is 2 years before the March on Washington. This is early in this classic era of Hollywood film, and Sidney Poitier is winning these Academy Awards, right? I'm going to go ahead and respond to one of these questions. Mr. Cruz, my Uncle Cruz here, is asking me about Sidney Poitier's immigration to the United States. I'm not 100% sure on this, but I do know that he immigrated. His family was from the Bahamas. I don't know about his language abilities, but again, I do think this speaks to the beauty of the bigger African diaspora, right? African Americans, our culture is so global that when Haitian folks immigrate to the United States, when Jamaicans come here, when people directly from Africa, when Afro-Latinos from Brazil and Cuba come here, there is a belonging with the Black American experience. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And that's, again, a lot of the actors we've been talking about have that Caribbean heritage, or more direct, a different connection to the African diaspora, for sure. And that's a trend that we're going to see continue as we get into the Black Power era.
Well, I just wanted to say that there's also internationally that parallel of, because a lot of countries like Jamaica, where my family's from, were colonized by the British, and were just there. I mean, and my ancestors, were enslaved Africans. So the idea that we had a parallel experience of trying to represent ourselves, creating our own culture, our own vernacular, and just patois. So there's that idea of, yes, Americans are doing this, and sometimes the American theater and music opens doors for us and kind of gives us the ability to, okay, I'm gonna sing hip hop, and I'm gonna sing, what I see. It's empowering. So it's kind of hip hop and different things that we're gonna see takes on a different meaning for people that are also coming out of colonialism. So
really glad that you mentioned that, Dorothy. Let's take a look at the opening slide for Act 4 now. This is again, more than anything else. Rest in peace, Chadwick Boseman. One of the main actors in this film, Black Panther, which came out in 2018, is a guy named Daniel Kaluuya. Daniel Kaluuya's people, if I'm not mistaken, he is from England, but his people, ancestors and direct ancestors, parents and grandparents, are from, I would either guess maybe Nigeria, Uganda, I'm not sure. But he speaks with like a pretty British accent, and he is playing these iconic Black American characters. He was he was the lead actor in Get Out. And he also played, I'm blanking on which Black Panther character it was that he played in a movie that just came out, right? So all these actors are kind of, it's fascinating, because the United States, we have the center of like this global pop culture that everybody loves. England still has like the classically trained like heart of theater. So a lot of actors go and do the training in England and then come here, where Hollywood is and where all the production is, right? But again, I don't think that's possible without the Black Power movement, and without this time period of the 70s and 80s, when thinkers and writers and actors like Leroy Jones, Amira Baraka, August Wilson are again going back to the stage. Let's take a look at the playbill, Dorothy, for Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. So we are going back to the stage in the 70s and 80s, and there is a renewed desire to represent ourselves in a really cool way. Now, here's what I love about Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. So kind of track with me here. Ma Rainey was a real blues singer kind of in the same vein as like Bessie Smith. She's 1920s, 1930s jazz singer. So she's in that era. This play was written in 1985, right? In the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement. And then it was adapted into a film last year, right? And it stars Chadwick Boseman in what I think is his very final role ever to be. I think that was his last filmed role. Viola Davis is in this. It's like an all-star, all-black cast of a film. But think about the historical layers that are happening here, right? We have a film that's made in 2020 based on a play that was written in the 1980s that is set in the 1930s. And again, to think about representation, how beautiful and how thick of a conversation are we able to have about race, gender, music, sexuality, death, losing actors and actresses because of the world that we live in and because of the unhealthy place that the United States often is for Black Americans. All these conversations are happening and they're wrapped up in that same film. So I would strongly, strongly encourage you to go to Netflix to watch Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, to go back and maybe look at some of August Wilson's work. He, I think, was like the preeminent writer and playwright of this post-civil rights Black Power era of the 70s and 80s. Fences was another play that was originally written by August Wilson.
It's so funny. And this is just hitting me, but your very, very first slide, or one of your first slides, was about the theater and the 1600s and Shakespeare. And now you brought Mulatto. And now we see from 1935, and now we see this play that was set in the 30s, and the stories resonating in the 80s and 2020. Like, why is there so much parallel with the theater? Like, why do we keep coming back to the theater?
It's because it's about representation. It is I would say that a theater or film is the purest and most full form of representation, right? Because music is obviously very powerful. And I want us to think about this as, I would say that Miles Davis, an artist on stage performing, that is theater, right?
Yeah.
Like spinning a record, like listening to something on Spotify is not theater, but actually sitting and watching an artist perform. Miles Davis sometimes would perform to the audience with his back turned. And there's a fascinating story behind that, because in the era that he came up, a lot of jazz musicians were like the Nicholas brothers. They were like Cab Calloway. They were supposed to be energetic and hyper. And Miles Davis said, no, I want to be taken seriously. Like this, I don't want you to laugh at me. Sit down in your chair and watch me make magic with this military instrument in my hand, right? So I think when you're performing on theater, when you're in the theater on stage, there's a power. And really it's about representation. And I think that's why it always comes back to the stage. As much as we say, oh, the Oscars are racist or the Academy Awards are racist or whatever, we still tune into the award show every year, right? We celebrate these people who are celebrated by these institutions, because there is something still 90 years later, there's still something magical about seeing one of us on stage that is representing us. There is something very real about being that larger than life figure, even now in 2021.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think I would say that's nowhere now in 2021 is that more true than when we talk about hip hop. Okay. So when we get into our second scene here for Act 4, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, which is that jazz is not the only big African-American art form that takes over the world. We are right now at a time where the whole world loves hip hop. Like, there are thousands of kids right now in like Germany and Poland that are writing trap music. And there's people in South Korea and in South Africa and in Southern Brazil that are filming hip hop music videos.
Absolutely.
Because what we have given to the world.
Call for expression.
A lot of hip hop artists that make this transition, that cross over into the Hollywood world, right? And again, I know that we think of this being normal, right? It's like, oh, what's the big deal? Yeah, of course a rapper wants to become an actor. Not really, right? Will Smith early on in his career couldn't even get nominated for a Grammy, because the Grammys didn't acknowledge hip hop as even really a real musical genre.
Right.
But then after Will Smith, we have Ice Cube, we have Tupac Shakur, we have Queen Latifah, right? And we have Common. And now we just think, oh, of course you're gonna transition over into acting. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when and how. So hip hop is, I think, the latest evolution in this conversation about Black performance and stage. And again, we can look at Black Panther, right? Out of the 12 or 13 or 14 songs on the official Black Panther soundtrack, which was one of the biggest soundtracks of last decade, those are mostly hip hop songs.
Wow.
Right? So hip hop is now a part of this conversation, because this is, in the same way that jazz was, this is the heart of young African Americans, and this is who we are. And this is the gift that we've once again given to the world.
I think it's important to talk about the origins of hip hop. Like, where did hip hop come from, and why was it so? And it exploded like how jazz did, but where did this hip hop come from?
Yeah.
What is
so I think, again, we need to think globally, right? By the time we get to the 70s and 80s, everyone around the world has been listening to jazz music for decades. People love African American music. They love African American culture. At the same time, though, in the 70s and 80s, during this Black Power era, we are still existing in conditions in neighborhoods like the South Bronx, like East St. Louis, like South Dallas, like the South Side of Chicago, like Overtown in Miami, that are what we would consider ghetto or hood type conditions, right? And we start to express ourselves in a new way, right? And I am somebody, because of my time in Miami and because of my love for Jamaica and reggae music, I don't think enough people understand how rooted hip hop music really is in dancehall culture and reggae culture of Jamaica. There's this tradition of taking a dub or taking a version of a song and then kind of spinning it and playing it in a new way. DJ Kool Herc was one of the founding, arguably the dude who threw the first hip hop party, and he immigrated from Kingston, I believe, in the 1960s, right? So hip hop comes from different places within the African diaspora, and it's like broadcast and it's elevated because of the platform that we have in the United States. And again, it becomes a part of our theatrical, it becomes a part of our film tradition here in the United States.
Absolutely. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that hip hop started in the Boogie Down Bronx by Jamaican immigrants, by people that are creating our own culture. And it's like just like that representation, like you said, we're tired of the conditions, so we're going to sing it out. It's just like a coping mechanism, but it's also us being us.
Right. It's who we are in conjunction with other Black folks from different parts of the diaspora, right? Big up Kool Herc. I love Kool Herc, and I love that connection between Jamaica and between New York. I think you made a great point, Kayla. You were talking about this idea of expressing myself and making clear the conditions that I'm living in.
Yes. Yeah.
Our final scene here, Act 4, Scene 3, really takes place over the past decade. Over the past 10 years, we've been having new and more intense conversations about issues that affect us in a way that I don't think we did before. And I don't think it's fair to say, oh, this is the new civil rights movement. This is the new Black Power movement, because every movement has issues that it's concerned with, right? The civil rights movement was concerned with voting and our status legally as citizens. Right. The Black Power movement was concerned with beauty and representation and community and how we defend ourselves. And what I've seen over the past 10 years, this new renaissance is concerned with issues that really often begin with violence. They begin with police brutality. I can remember literally 10 years ago, I was in college, and the first time I ever wrote to a newspaper was when Trayvon Martin was murdered by George Zimmerman. And I wrote this op-ed, and it started this back and forth, and I eventually became a writer for my student newspaper. I was one of the only Black people in the state, right? That was in 2011. By the time we get to 2014, again, a St. Louis connection. Shout out to all my family in St. Louis. Ferguson, St. Louis, Missouri, is where really the modern day Black Lives Matter movement begins. Yes. And it started in 2014 with the murder of Michael Brown, right? And there's all these examples we can talk about, one after another in 2017, 2018, and then last year. And then here's the beauty of art, right? Yeah. Art has the potential to make real for us and make real for other people what did not already exist in a real way in my mind, right? Like
Wow.
there are people during that time period of blackface in the 1800s, before the internet, before TV, before radio. There are white folks in random cities and towns in the north, like Iowa, who have literally never laid eyes on an African American, right? They have no context for who we are as a people. They have no context for our culture, but all of a sudden they do have context when the minstrel show comes to town like a circus, right? And that's the only context that they have, right? And again, this is the power of art as representation. I think we're in a now that one of my favorite Jay-Z lines is that history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And I don't think that we're in a repetition of the 1920s. I don't think we're in a repetition of the 1970s. I think we're in a blend of the two. We have the struggle and the anger and the violence, I think, of the 1970s. This is not a good time in American history. Like the history books are not going to be kind to 2020 and the 2010s. But we have, I think we've held on to a lot of the beauty and authenticity and the joy that we did see in the 1920s with jazz music, with the dance number that we saw earlier. So now we are in this Black Renaissance moment. And I didn't even want to try to choose a clip because there were too many to choose from. And I'm concerned about copyright issues, right? But what I would like to do as we wrap up and finish, Dorothy, there are 2 more slides here at the end of our presentation. If you are curious, if you want to look at some of the films that we've talked about here, and this list is by no means like an all-encompassing list. These are literally just the films and plays that we've referenced here today. I'm sure that Dorothy, via her Carroll County methods of communication, can get these a list of these to you. A lot of these are older than or previous to 1960, which means they're available anywhere on YouTube, and they're kind of common public commons, and you can access them. But here are the films that we've referenced today, and then one more slide, Dorothy. Here are some of the names of actors and actresses, and writers that we have referenced today. Of course, hopefully a lot of us have heard of Chadwick Boseman, but maybe some of us didn't know much about Dorothy Dandridge before today. Maybe not a lot of us knew about Ruby Dee or August Wilson or the Nicholas brothers before today. So this is a very, very, very short list of people that we can access throughout the rest of this month and the rest of the year. For me, as a Black History educator, every month is Black History Month. It feels just a little bit more than business as usual. It's not like, oh, I got to button up, and no, like this is what I do. So this is a process that I'm always going through. I'm always trying to pull and learn more. And again, to Dorothy, to Lisa, to Ms. Zielinski, thank you so much for this opportunity. And if we have some more questions here at the end of our slot, I definitely want to. If we have any folks who are not from the Woodson Mitchell.
I love how supportive your family is. I do think we're out of time, but I just wanted to thank you, Evan, for your expertise, for all of these wonderful conversations that we had, and all of the things that you made me think about and our audience think about. It was truly excellent. So thank you. And I think that wraps up. My name is Kayla Zielinski. This is Evan Woodson. We're from Macbeth Academy. And that wraps up our part. So I'll give it back to Dorothy.
Thank you, Kayla. And thank you so much for moderating so wonderfully. And thank you, Evan, for sharing your superb expertise and really giving us a remarkable presentation and experience tonight. And all the way from Brazil. So thank you. Thank you so much. I'd also like to take just a moment to thank our sponsors again, Macbeth Academy and the Carroll Citizens for Racial Equality, along with our host, Carroll County Public Library. So thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having us.